Hi, good afternoon. I want to join the other speakers in giving my heartfelt thanks to the organizers of the conference for this kind invitation. Pepe, Jose, it's been a pleasure to meet you, and Ramon, you've been a very generous and organized leader of this whole operation, so thank you from the logistical point of view. I know it is right before lunch, and I'm sure you are tired, as am I, after 2.5 days of conferencing, so I appreciate your patience. We will have lunch immediately following my talk. So I'm going to be bringing us back into the Southern Hemisphere in my remarks today, and looking at a large Picasso retrospective that was realized at the second São Paulo Bienal in 1953 and 54. Realism and abstraction, nationalism and internationalism. These terms, often understood as binaries, have come to bracket our understanding of the large-scale changes in the visual arts of Brazil following World War II. For example, if we considered the two works on screen, both paradigmatic examples of the Brazilian avant-garde of their respective moments. On the left is a 1935 oil-on-canvas painting by Cândido Portinari, and on the right, a 1956 work by Valdemar Cordeiro. We could contrast the shift from paintings created by artists such as Portinari, dedicated to social themes, here the toil of workers in a coffee plantation to harvest perhaps Brazil's best-known export, café, to the artwork on the right by Cordeiro. It too is a painting composed of tempera on oil panel, but it offers viewers a convergence of black lines and virtual planes on a uniformly white ground. And we could understand Cordeiro's work and his position as a bald-faced rejection of realism, and particularly a social realism composed of identifiably national subjects. Moreover, these artists delineated distinct trajectories within the history of modern art to validate their artistic projects. Portinari sought to place his production and Brazilian modern art as a whole in the company of Picasso and Diego Rivera. Following the viewing of Guernica at MoMA in early 1942, Portinari redoubled his centering of Picasso in his practice, creating a group of works in the mid-40s called the Drought Refugees, which depicted the devastation wrought by droughts and famine in the northeast of the country. Young artists like Cordeiro, by contrast, aimed to construct quite a different set of forefathers and peers, including Malevich and Mondrian. While nationalism, internationalism, realism, and abstraction certainly shaped the contentious debates post-war in Brazil and other countries in the Americas, where reigning figures like Portinari challenged an attempt to stymie the emergence of abstraction, and young artists like Cordeiro decried realist artists as outmoded and fraudulent, the meaning of these ideas, nation, world, real, abstract, were multifarious and in profound flux in Brazil and elsewhere post-1945. In the particular context of Brazil, following World War II, it was emerging from a quasi-fascist dictatorship, the Estado Novo, or new state regime of Getúlio Vargas. Under Vargas's rule, Brazil consolidated industry under state power, so there was state-incentivized industrialization and urbanization in the two major cosmopolitan cities of Rio, then the capital, and São Paulo. The cultural apparatus was also unified and magnified. So this is Lucio Costa's building for the Ministry of Education and Culture, which Portinari was commissioned to create the external and internal murals for. And indeed, Portinari, a communist from the 1940s, was the official artist of the Estado Novo regime, internal domestic commissions, as well as internationally representing the country at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, an image of which is shown on the left. Portinari was contemporaneously being celebrated internationally in a very emphatically apoliticized mode. There was a Portinari of Brazil retrospective at MoMA and a monograph that presented him as an Italian-Brazilian laborer from an agricultural setting in São Paulo who had gone to Europe and created no works and was this genius with no commitment underlined to the Communist Party. Under Vargas and following the post-World War II economic boom in Brazil, the cities of both Rio and São Paulo, here I'm showing you São Paulo, are transformed. So at the top left is a photograph by Claude Lévi-Strauss of São Paulo in the mid-30s, and then photographs from 1950 of the São Paulo that we know today of highways and skyscrapers. Brazil emerged from World War II seeing itself as a globally ascendant world power. This optimism was realized in grand scale of the moving of the capital of the country to the center of it, Brasilia, and the commissioning of Costa and Oscar Niemeyer to create a new national capital. Our existing art historical narratives for the post-war moment typically ascribe support for realism to artists aligned with the Communist Party like Portinari, as well as conservative academic circles, and support for abstraction to young artists and intellectuals whose political affiliations are cast as vaguely radical or anti-establishment or go unmentioned entirely. As Katie Siegel argued in the recent Munich post-war exhibition, which she co-curated, we need to be more careful to distinguish between, quote, the level of official policy, prescription, and national promotion of the arts and the day-to-day lives of artists, where the practices of abstraction and figuration were rarely seen as fixed names for them, as fixed as the names for them in discourse. Pardon me. Oh, pardon me. I guess I'm very hungry, speaking much too quickly. I apologize. I'll slow down. In the Brazilian case, the alignment of figuration with communism and abstraction with anti-communism were at best a partial truth. Portinari and Cordeiro, for example, were both active members of the Brazilian Communist Party. And the most influential interpreter of abstraction in Brazil, critic and political activist Mário Pedroso, was post-1945 a former communist, a former Trotskyist who had been active domestically and internationally, and after returning from exile from the Estado Novo regime, helped to found the Brazilian Socialist Party. Pedroso was sharply critical of the Communist Party's role in politics and culture in Brazil and abroad, but like Cordeiro and Portinari, believed art must engage society. So I want to complicate our dividing of this history into these neat stories. These rival histories and theories of modern art by Pedroso, Cordeiro, Portinari, and the Communist art press found a grand stage at the Second Bienal de São Paulo in the winter of 1953 to 54, where I will assert the attributions of meanings to the work of Picasso by actors from a spectrum of political alignments evaded any easy partisan or aesthetic delineations to reveal various attempts to reconcile Marxism and formalism and to wrestle with the place of the local in modernism. The Bienal, which began in 1951, realized its most ambitious and historically significant iteration at the Second Bienal. Representations from nations of the Americas, Asia, Europe, the Middle East were augmented by special presentations dedicated to artists and movements in the history of European and US modern art. Seminal works of European modernism, including Picasso's Still Life with Chair Caning, Umberto Boccioni's Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, as well as Picasso's Guernica and Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie, were installed in exhibitions dedicated to Cubism, Futurism, to style, as well as retrospectives of Calder, Klee, Picasso, and Henry Moore. There was also a nucleus of monographic exhibitions dedicated to symbolists and proto-expressionist artists, including Munch and Ensor. And these are two works that were displayed in São Paulo, Self-Portrait with Masks and Evening in Karl Johan Street. The figure largely responsible for this remarkable achievement was Mário Pedroso, and above is a photograph I love of him passionately defending abstraction. His writing of the late 40s and early 50s, including some of the titles that I'm showing you below, established the essential, if sometimes seemingly contradictory, poles of the critics' thinking about modern art. Namely, Pedroso asserted the universality of creativity at the same time as he unspun an evolutionary European understanding of the development of avant-garde art. Simultaneously transhistorical and teleological, Eurocentric and transnational, formalist and Marxist, Pedroso proposed a redefinition of modernism that intertwined the significance of non-objective abstraction with a recognition of the art of outsiders. The seemingly conventionality of Pedroso's Panorama of Modern Painting, a survey book, which adopted Wolfland's notion of enduring stylistic binaries and has a similarity in both content and approach to the accounts of modernism put forward by Kahnweiler, Barr, and others in the 20s and 30s, has deferred its study up until recent years. In the book, Pedroso proposes an account of modern art in which Impressionism and Cubism begat a succession of artistic movements that can be distilled into two opposing trajectories, which he describes as expressive and constructive. Barr described them as non-geometrical and geometrical abstract art. Within this familiar evolutionary scenario, however, the Brazilian critic makes a significant detour. His interest lies not in the direct descendants of these lines, but in their outliers. And the two figures, in this early moment, the figure he singles out for particular praise is Klee. Later, Calder will serve a role as these key participants in modernism, but essential kind of ulterior options within its schemes. In his larger body of both art writing and Gestalt theory and psychology, contemporaneous to this book, Pedroso articulates a centering of outliers marginal to society and how we have to think about creativity. And for him in the late 40s and early 50s, this particularly meant mental health patients and children. There's much more to say about this, but I will stick to my march forward with the second Bienal. Pedroso thereby forged a radically inclusive conception of modernism that recast a European-centered story as a global one in which creativity is not the sole domain of artists. It includes mental health patients and children and eventually others, but part of a larger inheritance shared by all. In his organizational efforts for the second Bienal, for which he was based in Europe for 9 months, he helped to assemble all of the European special exhibitions. So he was involved in the De Style exhibition that featured Broadway Boogie Woogie that I showed earlier. He contributed to the organization of the large Picasso Retrospective. He also endeavored to counterbalance the foregrounding of Picasso with an elevation of Klee, and he sort of cross the map of Central Europe, trying to convince everyone that a Klee retrospective is what the German government should be sending rather than an expressionist exhibition they plan to send successfully. Unlike the other historical presentations at the Bienal, which were organized in collaboration and funded by foreign nations, the Brazilian organizers independently commissioned and underwrote the costs of a large Picasso retrospective, the first ever mounted in South America. The Bienal also hired Maurice Jardot, who we heard about earlier with Rocio's presentation, to curate the exhibition and author an essay in an extensive Portuguese language catalog it produced. The realized exhibition included 51 paintings and surveyed the major stages of Picasso's work from 1907 to the early 50s. In addition to documenting his Cubist practice and including the remarkable journey of the only journey of Guernica south of the equator. The exhibition included a number of major works from the 1920s, including Guitar and Newton and Armchair. While it's possible to reconstruct from the archival record Pedroso's desire as he premised the Klee heirs of a face-off between Picasso and Klee, the narrative of modern arts ultimately constructed depended upon these exhibitions' installations in Brazil by Pedroso's colleagues. The Bienal was realized in two nearly identical buildings, these two buildings at the top of the model and pictured down below, in a new modernist complex of buildings built by Niemeyer for the year-long celebration of the city of São Paulo's 4th centenary, of which the Bienal was the inaugural event. Niemeyer relegated the few permanent walls to the perimeter of each pavilion and thereby created enormous, largely uniform halls. The biennial organizers used these temporary walls and partitions to divide up the spaces, and via the large ramps and these kind of open spaces we see across history and time and artists throughout the exhibition. However, the organizers divided the exhibition between these two buildings in a way that underscored national and regional identities. So the works from European nations, as well as those of Indonesia, Israel, and Japan, were displayed in the building called the Pavilion of Nations, which you're seeing two views of the interior here, and those from countries of the Americas, including Brazil, occupied the Pavilion of States. So the grand face-off that Pedroso had envisioned between Picasso and Klee was not to be. Klee was a few stories above Picasso amidst a slurry of other exhibitions. However, the contrast that was emphasized by the installation, that of the retrospective exhibitions of Picasso and Calder, suited Pedroso's polemical aims just as well, and he lobbied unsuccessfully for Calder to be awarded the event's top prize. The comparison of these two shows was facilitated by their mirror-like architectural settings, but also by the fact that they were both retrospectives installed by their curators to emphasize a particular body of the artist's work. In the case of Picasso, Jargeau arranged the display chronologically along the curved wall of the atrium, culminating with Guernica on the only rectilinear wall within the space. The diagram on the right is a diagram from the correspondence that Jargeau sent back to Picasso, which included a postcard of a photo of São Paulo as this modernist capital, sort of like the images that I had shown you at the beginning. So we see the installation marching chronologically along the wall. So I'm just gonna, the Bienal archive in São Paulo is a remarkable resource, and they've done this massive decade-long digitization and research into their photographic collection. So we're the beneficiary of that research. So from the teens into the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the wall that Guernica occupied, and then this kind of secondary, little commented upon gallery of recent works at the end. In the Calder exhibition, rather than focusing on Calder's historical works from earlier decades, René Darnancourt, director of MoMA and curator of the exhibition, installed no less than 6 of the artist's recent large mobiles in the atrium's double-height ceiling. As we can see from the sketch that he realized of his installation, the mobiles are rendered like these cloud-like clustered of curved lines, so he distributed them throughout the exhibition. In the weeks and months that followed the opening of the second Bienal, Pedroso authored articles and gave interviews in which he downplayed his own organizational role and instead donned the hat of critic and agitator. For example, he caused a controversy that resulted in his losing his job as a critic, art and political critic for a daily newspaper when he spoke out against recent work by beloved artist Portinari, including the murals that Portinari had created, commissioned by the Brazilian government, that were gifted to the United Nations building in New York. Furthermore, Pedroso expanded upon his earlier writing, dividing modern art between these trajectories of expressive and constructive. He argued that artists who practiced the former, from Picasso to the abstract expressionist, treated art as a catharsis, which he saw as egotistical and short-sighted. He wrote, quote, "Picasso has exhausted all the processes of deformation," end quote. In contrast, he argued that the constructive or geometric abstract artist, of which he saw Calder as being aligned with, sought to create works, quote, "of sufficient universality to give our times what they lack, spiritual cohesion," end quote. Cordeiro, however, that abstract artist that I began with, and you're going to see more of his writing and thinking now, who was perhaps the most polemical of these young abstract artists, did not view Picasso's production as a foil or the erroneous path, but as a multivalent problem to be thought through. Cordeiro was unconvinced by Pedroso's redefinition of modernism that entwined non-objective abstraction with the recognition of artists who were outliers or outsiders to society, as he declared in the manifesto for the abstract group that he led, the Rupture Group, in 1952, where he decries erroneous naturalism by children, so-called primitives. In texts and public talks that followed the second Bienal, Cordeiro responded to Pedroso's version of modern art put forward at the Bienal, with at times hit-you-over-the-head integration of Marxist terminology in hopes of articulating a theory of abstraction connected to day-to-day material reality that he hoped would attract his pro-realist aesthetic rivals and political allies in the Communist Party to the validity of abstraction as an artistic process and as a potential political tool. Rather than expressive or constructive tendencies, he proposes that the two fundamental opposing tendencies of modern art are the art of expression and the art of creation, which in other texts he calls the art as a form of knowledge. He then pointed in public remarks that he gave after the second Bienal After it had opened, as it's still open, he uses it as sort of his slideshow, if you will, for stating a history of art, and he points to works on view by Inzer and Munch as examples of proto-expressionism, and compares cubism and futurism using the works on view. He asserted that expressive art limited itself to quantitative changes and remained in a feudal phase, whereas the art of creation, including futurism and cubism, should be understood as an art as a form of knowledge that allows for qualitative leaps. He does not mask the hierarchy that he sees between these approaches. He also describes expressionism as parasitic. Nevertheless, he interestingly frames both Picasso and Klee as artists who require a dialectical appreciation, writing that Picasso should be seen as an artist of expression and creation at the same time for the same work of art. He cites Guernica as the epitome of this complexity, though in his explanation for its dialectical nature, is confined to pointing out its various interpretations, saying that the work has been lauded by both formalists and those emphasizing content. I'm coming to the end. The ambivalent critics at the cultural magazine of the Brazilian Communist Party, Fundamentals, magazine of modern culture, expressed regarding Picasso's displays at the Second Biennial rest in a sense on just such an accounting for the contribution of the artist as being claimable by multiple agendas. One critic writing for this magazine argues that the essence of Picasso's role as, quote, a fertile creator of myth and a political activist faithful to his time and people, end quote, was masked in the biennial exhibition, which excluded recent works like the massacre in Korea, and instead, they argued, presented Picasso as a cosmopolitan, bohemian artist of myriad styles. The Fundamentals critics fascinatingly asserted that, quote, the presence of Guernica, a canvas that is a true symbol of the horror that rallied men of culture of the entire world to the fascist portrayal, is not sufficient to overcome the perplexity that the spectator feels lost in this extensive Picassoine gallery, as if in a fantastical store of nonsense, helpless and unable to recreate the path of the master, end quote. The museum gallery is thus likened to a store, indoctrinating new consumers, and the biennial, as Fundamentals writers had argued since the inception of the event, was interpreted as a tool for anti-communist propaganda and as a neo-imperialist agenda aligned with the United States and capitalist interests of the wealthiest in Brazil. As they stated on the cover of the magazine a number of times, the biennial was, to their mind, against Brazilian artists and against national culture. One of the numerous denouncements of the Bienal was in fact illustrated with a cartoon where one of the biennial's defenders, I think probably Mario Pedrosa is who they're spoofing, holding up these two canvases, is shown pleasing the rich, the fat cat patrons, by visualizing the biennial as a cannon and shooting down Picasso's peace dove. If the biennial was their target, Fundamentals critics nevertheless portray a remarkable skepticism towards Picasso's ability to serve as a lightning rod for communist activists and social realist artists in Brazil during the Cold War. In fact, Picasso was conspicuously absent from the journal, which included multiple in-depth studies to artists ranging from Leonardo da Vinci to social realist practice in the Soviet Union, while Picasso received only 2 dedicated texts in the journal's 8-year run. One wonders whether the communist press reception of Guernica at the Second Biennial represents an inflection point in the post-war reading of the painting, where a style-based interpretation of the work as one of several apexes of a protean career of a genius proffered by Barr and others had blunted, at least from the orthodox left's point of view, the political potency of the work, a hazard that was perhaps particularly true in a country that was subjected to repeated US imperialisms. Pedroso, for one, yoked his low esteem of Picasso's utility for young artists to his dismissal of abstract expressionism as an egotistical path. And the worry of the communist press was perhaps warranted. After all, at the Second Bienal, Vargas, the former dictator now democratically returned to power in his white suit here, served as the honorary president of the event and presided over ceremonies praising the artists and intellectuals who his prior administration had censored and imprisoned, Pedroso principal among them. While Vargas himself was savvy enough not to be pictured in front of the work, conservative and moderate Vargas allied positions happily arrayed themselves before it for photo opportunities, trading on the work's prestige and seeking to be cast as leaders as a globally ascendant Brazil. And in fact, Juscelino Kubitschek would become the president of Brazil in 1955. These are both governors at this point. In conclusion, abstract artist obliteration of the identifiably national can be understood as an optimistic turn to the international from the local, in line with the kind of boosterism that the biennial itself represented, seeing São Paulo as a global city on par with Venice and New York and Paris. But also, it must be read as a deeply critical gesture, skeptical of the use of artist envisioning of the nation by various governments and political parties, and also skeptical that the largely rural imaginary of the national was still relevant to the emerging middle-class and industrialized laborers of Brazil's rapidly industrializing mid-century cosmopolitan cities. Thank you very much.